Everyone followed Amelia Martinez and her entourage to the Qingyin Pavilion. By now, quite a few people had already gathered in the pavilion, perhaps having heard of Amelia Martinez from Ava Wilson. When they finally saw her, they looked overjoyed, yet a voice cut through the crowd, "Isn't this Amelia Martinez?" Amelia Martinez's reputation had spread far and wide, and as soon as her name was mentioned, everyone turned their gaze towards her. She hadn't expected such an occurrence, and among the crowd were a few young noblemen who had previously met her, now enthusiastically joining in. Their eyes were filled with excitement and surprise. Hadn't Amelia Martinez supposedly passed away? How could she be here now? Amelia Martinez, however, remained calm and composed. Feigning surprise, she covered her face with a smile, and with a slight nod, said, "I don't know who this Amelia Martinez you all speak of is. Lately, many people have said I resemble her greatly. If I have the chance, I would love to meet her myself." The crowd collectively gasped. Was this not Amelia Martinez? Could there possibly be a second beauty like her in this world? Some doubted it and were about to voice their skepticism. "My lady has only recently arrived in North Xian Kingdom and has no knowledge of this Amelia Martinez," Emily Johnson explained from beside her. Amelia Martinez had instructed her beforehand that her identity was not to be revealed, so Emily Johnson quickly stepped forward to help ease the situation. The crowd sighed in understanding. "Indeed, this is Miss Amelia, a friend of mine," Charles Blackwood suddenly added. Seeing that some were about to speak up, he raised his hand and revealed a token on his belt. Seeing it, the crowd fell silent. Naturally, Amelia Martinez didn't miss this small action. Although she didn't know what kind of token it was clearly not ordinary. Furthermore, with the surname Ko, if he wasn't royalty, he was certainly someone with high connections. Since Charles Blackwood offered no further explanation, Amelia Martinez chose not to press him with questions. Observing him, she noticed that, although his lips still held a gentle smile as warm as a spring breeze, there was an undeniable air of authority about him. Charles Blackwood acted as if nothing had happened. He casually walked around to the other side of the table, extended his hand, and with a smile said, "Please, everyone, take your seats and allow Miss Amelia to present the challenge." The crowd, finally regaining their composure, began to sit down, though most kept a respectful distance from Charles Blackwood. Only a few finely dressed young men dared to sit nearby. Seeing Charles Blackwood close by, no one dared to be loud or unruly, and instead quietly observed Amelia Martinez. Amelia Martinez covered her face with a soft smile and motioned for Emily Johnson to pour a cup of wine. The crowd watched as Emily Johnson presented a wine cup much larger than usual. Its crystal-clear surface gleamed like glass, though it was porcelain, remarkably delicate and thin. Intricate carvings decorated the rim, and the wine within reflected a series of elegant cloud-like patterns, its dark red hue faintly visible. After preparing, Emily Johnson and Si Hong stood nearby, their faces full of excitement. More people arrived, crowding in the doorway, some leaning against the frame, some crouching at the threshold. The Qingyin Pavilion had never hosted so many before, surely drawn by the allure of Amelia. A beauty as captivating as she was talented, she naturally had a magnetic appeal. However, this cup of wine was no easy challenge. Amelia Martinez and Emily Johnson had spent days guessing the answers and could only manage to get 1 in 10 correct. These people, so confident now, might just leave disappointed. "Young lords, this wine has been sitting here for quite a while, and it may lose its original flavor if it stays much longer. If no one guesses correctly before the time runs out, the wine shall be mine," said Amelia with a slight smile. The crowd had been eager for a chance and, seeing the wine's quality, knew it was no ordinary drink. They quickly urged, "Please, milady, tell us." Amelia Martinez stood up and took a few measured steps, careful not to make the question too difficult nor too easy. At the beginning, it was best to choose something moderate. If it was too difficult, people might lose interest and leave, which would be counterproductive. All right, everyone, listen carefully, Amelia Martinez said as she sat back down, gracefully gesturing with her hand. Why do birds fly south for the winter? Everyone froze for a moment, then began to laugh. This question was truly too simple, even a child who had attended school would know the answer. It seemed that this question was nothing extraordinary. Only Charles Blackwood sensed that there was more to it. If it were that simple, it wouldn't be a question from Amelia Martinez. A man in a purple robe sitting beside Charles Blackwood asked, Your Highness, why don't you answer? Do you know the answer? Charles Blackwood smirked, sipping his tea. The man in purple was taken aback, not expecting that the prince wouldn't know the answer. However, he couldn't very well outshine the prince, so he humbly whispered, If your highness doesn't know, then I certainly don't. Though he spoke deferentially, the man in purple was still perplexed. He already knew the answer but didn't dare say it. Being fond of a fine drink, he now felt even more restless. Those around him didn't dare to speak up either. Though they whispered among themselves, they noticed that the prince's side remained silent and didn't want to steal his thunder, risk losing the wine, or incurring his wrath. So, they kept quiet. Amelia Martinez noticed that no one was responding and that a few people occasionally glanced at Charles Blackwood, perhaps too intimidated by him to speak. She then declared, Here in the Qingyin Pavilion, we disregard rank. Anyone with an answer may speak. Saying this, Amelia Martinez looked over at Charles Blackwood. At that moment, he happened to look up, their eyes meeting briefly. Amelia Martinez pretended not to notice, turning away to ignore Charles Blackwood's half-smiling gaze. As soon as she spoke, the crowd grew lively again. The man in purple sitting next to the prince could no longer hold back and stood up, saying, Because the south is warmer, and if the birds want to survive, they naturally migrate southward. Everyone hung their heads, regretting that such a simple answer had been given by someone else. The man in purple was visibly pleased, almost ready to raise his cup and drink. But Charles Blackwood shook his head with a smile. Amelia Martinez noticed, thinking that Charles Blackwood had caught on that the answer was not so simple. She smiled and shook her head. The man in purple was incredulous. He had answered such a straightforward question incorrectly. Feeling dissatisfied, he wanted to argue, but Charles Blackwood quickly pulled him back into his seat. The crowd was equally astonished, looking at one another in confusion. This was the answer everyone had thought of, yet it was wrong. Although they were puzzled, they were also secretly relieved that they hadn't spoken up themselves, or they'd be the ones embarrassed. Emily Johnson, observing the crowd's underestimation of Amelia Martinez's question, saw the situation clearly and confidently said, Gentlemen, I suggest you think it over carefully. My lady's questions are never so simple. Hearing this, everyone furrowed their brows and sank into deep thought. Charles Blackwood also became pensive, realizing that this question must have a hidden twist. Earlier in the day, Amelia Martinez had already left him perplexed, and now he had no choice but to proceed with caution. But just then, Amelia Martinez suddenly spoke up, Everyone, I'm afraid this cup of wine can't wait any longer. Saying so, she took a small sip. Seeing this, everyone wore expressions of disappointment. Amelia Martinez remained unfazed and said, We'll stop here for today. If anyone is interested, you're welcome to come back tomorrow. I'll be here to welcome you. Everyone stood up, ready to leave, muttering as they went. Though they felt somewhat disappointed, the thought of that fine wine stirred a sense of pride among these scholars, who naturally wanted to showcase their wit in front of others. After all, to outshine everyone here would be the ultimate achievement. However, the man in purple was not willing to let it go so easily. He had lost face in front of everyone, although no one dared to laugh, his arrogant demeanor, typical of a noble young lord, was clear. Even with the prince by his side, he couldn't fully contain his resentment and demanded directly, You claim my answer was wrong, so tell me what the correct answer is. Amelia Martinez couldn't be bothered to argue and continued to sip her wine leisurely. The crowd, curious, lingered to see her response. Calm and unhurried, Amelia Martinez's attitude only infuriated the man in purple further. For him, it was outrageous that a mere woman dared to treat him with such indifference. Yet, with the prince's presence and his apparent relationship with this woman, he dared not be too reckless and silently endured, waiting to see what explanation she would give. If she failed to answer, he wouldn't hold back. When Amelia Martinez finally finished the last sip, she savored the taste, while Emily Johnson watched nervously from the side. She could tell the man in purple wasn't ordinary, and with his prideful temperament, she feared things might escalate if they accidentally provoked him. Amelia Martinez pressed her hand reassuringly on Emily Johnson's, signaling her not to worry. She dabbed her lips with a silk handkerchief before saying, "It's because they walk too slowly, so they must fly south." The crowd buzzed with surprise. Charles Blackwood, who had already experienced her wit, remained unfazed, but the man in purple nearly exploded with frustration. Charles Blackwood understood his companion's anger well and tapped the table, signaling him to sit down. Reluctantly, the man in purple took his seat, drained his cup of tea, clearly feeling unsatisfied but unable to do anything about it. The rest of the crowd was equally astounded, they hadn't expected such an answer. Those who weren't too rigid in their thinking could finally see the humor in her response and clapped their hands in delight, although they felt somewhat ashamed for not having thought of it sooner. Encouraged by the simplicity of the answer, they believed that if they thought a bit more creatively, they could solve the next question. With renewed determination, they eagerly asked Amelia Martinez to pose another challenge. But Amelia Martinez wasn't about to oblige so easily, her intent was to keep them wanting more, unafraid of lacking silver in her purse in the future. Seeing her reluctance, they had no choice but to disperse, though with some lingering reluctance. Just then, a voice cut through the crowd. "Today, I'd like to see what kind of difficult questions you have." A delicate young woman suddenly walked in. She had a sharp chin, narrow eyes, her hair arranged in a high bun adorned with a morning sun jade phoenix hairpin, and a choker of gold and glass beads around her neck. She wore a long red gold-embroidered dress that swept the floor, and a fitted crimson silk robe, cinched at the waist with a pale green palace sash. With gracefully arched brows and a slender figure, she was elegant and alluring, her rosy cheeks emanating charm even before her red lips parted. Amelia Martinez frowned slightly, setting her cup lightly on the table. As she watched the woman enter, she had to admit her beauty, but something about her stirred an immediate feeling of distaste. The crowd, however, seemed intrigued by the newcomer. Perhaps it was due to Amelia Martinez's own disposition, but they too found this woman's ungracious manner somewhat distasteful. Right after, the person who stepped in made Amelia Martinez shudder. It was none other than Henry Blackwood. Amelia Martinez felt a chill in her heart. Why was he here? Could this woman be his new bride, Princess Oliver Kingsley? Only now did Amelia Martinez find something familiar in this woman's face. For a brief moment, she felt a wave of unease. Suppressing the bitterness welling up within her, she stood up to greet them. "I wonder what guidance the two of you bring." Charles Blackwood noticed the slight panic in Amelia Martinez's eyes and couldn't help but feel a trace of disdain. "Amelia Martinez, let's see how long you can keep this up." Henry Blackwood seemed as if he hadn't noticed Amelia Martinez at all, or perhaps he viewed her as nothing more than a stranger, completely devoid of warmth. He let the woman beside him continue, "We came to admire the flowers today and heard that, oh yes, Miss Amelia would be posing a question. I got curious, so I decided to come and listen." Princess Oliver Kingsley paid no heed to Amelia Martinez, taking a sip of the tea Ava Wilson had served her, then immediately spat it out onto the ground, frowning. "Is this the quality of tea that the Chinese Pavilion dares to serve? If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave," Amelia Martinez replied. Seeing this woman's obvious intention to cause trouble, she couldn't help but laugh coldly to herself. Just a minor princess, yet so arrogant. She showed no reaction, merely glanced at Henry Blackwood, who was sitting beside her and looking out the window, and calmly replied. You, Princess Oliver Kingsley, spoiled and pampered from a young age, had even Henry Blackwood yielding to her whims. She could hardly believe this woman dared to oppose her, the dignified Princess Oliver Kingsley, who would one day become Empress. Amelia Martinez said no more, signaling Emily Johnson to clear the tea and no longer serve any. Princess Oliver Kingsley fumed, her hands clenched as her face flushed with anger. But noticing Henry Blackwood wasn't helping her, jealousy flared up even more. While she didn't dare act out with Henry Blackwood, she felt this small courtesan should be within her reach to deal with. If thoroughly provoked, she'd think nothing of having the Qingyin Pavilion demolished. Amelia Martinez spoke coldly. Today, I will pose a question. If you answer it, Amelia will apologize and offer you a pot of fine wine. But if you cannot, I ask that you never set foot in my Qingyin Pavilion again. Frustrated by Princess Oliver Kingsley's arrogance, Amelia Martinez dropped all pretense of courtesy and replied sharply. Emily Johnson and Ava Wilson exchanged glances, thinking that a pot of wine was likely worth half of their reserves. It was quite generous, but on second thought, they felt reassured, convinced the lady would be unlikely to answer correctly. Quickly, they brought out a pot of wine. Everyone took a sharp breath, a whole pot of wine. Even Charles Blackwood couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. It was clear that Amelia Martinez meant to make things difficult for Princess Oliver Kingsley. Otherwise, why would she be willing to offer up such a pot of wine when earlier she hadn't even spared a single cup? It seemed Amelia Martinez was willing to clash with Princess Oliver Kingsley over this man, and Princess Oliver Kingsley must have heard of Amelia Martinez, using the excuse of flower viewing to come stir up trouble. Yet, Amelia Martinez remained calm, unafraid and unbothered, while Princess Oliver Kingsley was visibly irritated and quick to anger. Charles Blackwood found the drama increasingly entertaining, a smile tugging at his lips as he lightly fanned himself, curious to see how long Amelia Martinez would stay composed and, in the end, which woman Henry Blackwood would support. But Princess Oliver Kingsley didn't seem to mind. She even looked at Amelia Martinez with a sneering gaze, full of disdain. She raised her hand slightly, brushing it as if dusting off dirt, and sat down elegantly, resting her hand on the table with a lazy expression, acting as though Amelia Martinez was of no consequence. Amelia Martinez ignored her, inwardly determined to make her lose face shortly. Just then, Princess Oliver Kingsley spoke up again. What's worth betting on with just a pot of wine? I can casually bring out a pot of wine that's leagues beyond yours. She paused, her smile vanishing as her expression turned cold, her voice sharp. If we're going to bet, let's make it big. You and I will each pose a question. Whoever cannot answer, Princess Oliver Kingsley deliberately dragged out her words, a hint of malice on her lips. Amelia Martinez felt a chill inside, unsure what question this princess might ask, but sensing from her expression that she intended to cause harm. Though she maintained a calm facade, her mind was already racing, uncertain how this would end, and she fixed her gaze on Princess Oliver Kingsley. Princess Oliver Kingsley seemed to read Amelia Martinez's thoughts. She laughed softly, covering her mouth with her dainty hand and casting a glance at Henry Blackwood. Amelia Martinez followed her gaze to Henry Blackwood, who remained expressionless and solemn, leaving her unable to discern what he might be thinking. Speak, Amelia Martinez said, raising her voice slightly. If someone loses, then they must. Princess Oliver Kingsley was about to finish her sentence when Amelia Martinez interrupted, taking control. My lady, it was you who proposed this wager, so naturally, I will set the terms. Princess Oliver Kingsley hadn't expected to be outmaneuvered so easily and grew mildly angry, replying, what if I don't agree? Then there's no need to wager at all. I would ask you to leave, Amelia Martinez replied, standing up as if to walk away. Seeing her actually about to leave, Princess Oliver Kingsley grew anxious, quickly standing up and saying hastily, Fine, tell me your terms. With a satisfied smile, Amelia Martinez turned back, pretending to hesitate as she looked at Princess Oliver Kingsley, shaking her head as if she were unwilling. But Princess Oliver Kingsley, not one to let things go easily, immediately declared, "If I lose, I'll never step into your territory again. But if you lose, you'll never be allowed to leave this place." The arrogance in Princess Oliver Kingsley's words matched her character, but Amelia Martinez naturally wouldn't agree. She raised her eyebrows, chuckling softly, "Then I won't wager." Princess Oliver Kingsley hadn't expected that answer, and for a moment, she was caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. "If a face fell from the sky, would you take it?" Amelia Martinez asked. While Princess Oliver Kingsley was still stunned, Amelia Martinez had already slipped away. By the time everyone realized, Princess Oliver Kingsley was fuming, disregarding her noble image as she prepared to charge after her. Ava Wilson blocked the door. Princess Oliver Kingsley raised her hand to slap her, but someone caught her wrist mid-swing. Looking up, she saw it was Henry Blackwood. At this, she threw a fit, bursting into tears. Seizing a moment when Henry Blackwood was distracted, she broke free, storming toward Amelia Martinez and raising her hand to slap her. Amelia Martinez hadn't expected Princess Oliver Kingsley to storm into the rear courtyard. From her posture, she could tell the princess intended to strike, so she swiftly dodged. At that moment, Henry Blackwood and Emily Johnson arrived, while Charles Blackwood stood nearby, watching with an amused, taunting smile. Henry Blackwood stood there, watching Amelia Martinez deftly dodge each strike, his heart silently sighing. Earlier in the main hall, she had already surprised him, now, he was even more bewildered. Was this truly his? Amelia? How could she defy others so strongly? She seemed healthier too, with no trace of sorrow in her expression. In the past, just a few days of separation would leave her in tears and sorrow. How could there be such a drastic difference? Ava Wilson finally rushed over and grabbed Princess Oliver Kingsley to hold her back. Princess Oliver Kingsley, seeing someone dare to stop her, immediately said arrogantly, "Do you know who I am? Let go of me at once." Amelia Martinez was already drenched in sweat, glancing at Henry Blackwood, who stood as steady as a mountain, watching her being chased around like a monkey without stepping forward to help. Thankfully, she had been practicing some self-defense lately, otherwise, she would surely have fainted by now. Princess Oliver Kingsley was still shouting angrily, and Amelia Martinez flashed a cold smile at Henry Blackwood, then suddenly approached Princess Oliver Kingsley and slapped her hard. The sharp sound of the slap left everyone stunned, even Princess Oliver Kingsley, who stopped crying, dumbfounded as she stared at Amelia Martinez. She never expected that a seemingly frail woman like Amelia Martinez would dare to strike her after learning her identity. She assumed Amelia Martinez wouldn't dare do anything, relying on Henry Blackwood's presence to protect herself. Immediately, Princess Oliver Kingsley began to wail loudly, her face streaked with tears, her cries shrill and unpleasant, making Amelia Martinez feel irritated. Princess Oliver Kingsley clung to Henry Blackwood, crying, "Did you see that, my lord? She dared to hit me. Who does she think she is?" Amelia Martinez stared coldly at Henry Blackwood, waiting to see which side he would choose. Henry Blackwood met her gaze, his expression cold and complex, as though judging her. Amelia Martinez gave a bitter smile, thinking to herself, "If you dare, come here and strike me, then I'd have to thank you." But Henry Blackwood said nothing, turning around and walking away. Princess Oliver Kingsley saw this, casting a hateful glare at Amelia Martinez, as though she wanted to devour her. She knew now that Henry Blackwood wouldn't intervene for her, feeling both resentful and furious. How could this lowly woman dare to compete with her for her husband? Amelia Martinez paid her no mind, coldly brushing past Princess Oliver Kingsley as she headed back to her room. Yet, unwilling to concede, Princess Oliver Kingsley summoned the courage to lift her hand again. By the time Amelia Martinez noticed, it was already too late. Instinctively, she closed her eyes, but the expected slap never came. Amelia Martinez slowly opened her eyes and found a man in white standing in front of her. It was Charles Blackwood. For some reason, a faint sense of disappointment welled up within her as she saw Henry Blackwood walking away without a backward glance. He had already gone upstairs. Charles Blackwood still wore a smile, effortlessly holding Princess Oliver Kingsley's raised hand in his strong yet slender grip. Princess Oliver Kingsley struggled a few times but found it impossible to break free, and the grip was starting to hurt. Being someone who was all bark and no bite, Princess Oliver Kingsley felt helpless seeing Henry Blackwood ignore her. She began to plead, "Brother Charles, let me go. Please, let go." But Charles Blackwood didn't release her. Though he still wore a faint smile, he maintained his firm grip. Only when Amelia Martinez had stepped aside did he finally speak, "Princess Oliver Kingsley, it would be wise to show a little restraint." With that, he released her hand without the slightest hint of gentleness. Princess Oliver Kingsley winced, rubbing her wrist, now marked with a faint red line, feeling utterly wronged. She had come here to cause trouble, yet no one was helping her, and instead, she was left humiliated. Charles Blackwood gestured for her to leave. Seeing this, Princess Oliver Kingsley wasn't about to let it go easily. She said, "Brother Charles, you do know this woman is just a courtesan, tainted and seductive. You'd better be careful around her." Charles Blackwood frowned slightly, finding her remarks unreasonable, but he said nothing. He simply gestured again, signaling her to leave. "Brother Charles, even if we can't be together, you don't have to abandon yourself like this," Princess Oliver Kingsley insisted, using her last card. Her eyes filled with tears, and she feigned a delicate appearance. In the past, it had been Charles Blackwood who had first come to propose to her, followed later by Henry Blackwood, and her father had ultimately chosen to marry her off to Henry Blackwood as a political bet. Princess Oliver Kingsley assumed that Charles Blackwood still had feelings for her, and now, looking pitiful, she said so. But after witnessing her earlier outburst, her current act of vulnerability only appeared more staged and insincere, making her even less appealing. Charles Blackwood withdrew his hand and simply pointed to the door, signaling for her to leave. Seeing this, Princess Oliver Kingsley had no choice but to walk away, though she was unwilling. Before leaving, she shot a venomous glare at Amelia Martinez's back, her tear-filled eyes flashing with resentment. Charles Blackwood's face showed a mix of emotions, and it took him a moment to regain his composure. He wondered if Amelia Martinez had taken Princess Oliver Kingsley's words to heart, especially the last remark. If she had picked up on anything unusual or guessed anything, it could ruin everything. Considering this, Charles Blackwood realized he couldn't afford to be careless. He quickly approached Amelia Martinez and, in a reassuring tone, said, "Don't mind what Princess Oliver Kingsley said." Amelia Martinez chuckled inwardly, thinking that it seemed the Prime Minister's daughter lacked any refinement. She likely had never experienced such humiliation and would certainly create a fuss about this. "So, you married a virtuous woman, yet she turned out to be a tigress," she mused with a hint of satisfaction. "Now you should see, for all my flaws, I'm still better than her." Amelia is indeed from a courtesan background, she was right, so there's no need to mind it, Amelia Martinez replied after hearing Charles Blackwood's words. She didn't feel affected by it. Let her say whatever she wants. Charles Blackwood didn't feel the same. The more Amelia Martinez acted as if nothing had happened, the more he suspected she knew something. He couldn't be sure, though, so he gazed at her delicate face, as if trying to detect any hint of deception. However, Amelia Martinez remained calm, even with a faint smile, leaving him unsure if she truly didn't care or if she was hiding her feelings skillfully. "There's really no need for you to worry, my lord. Amelia is happy for you. Had you married that woman, your life wouldn't be as carefree as it is now," Amelia Martinez said with a charming smile, steering the conversation in a different direction. Charles Blackwood paused, then smiled, half-jokingly replying, "Indeed, if I were to marry, I'd want a wife like Amelia." Amelia Martinez smiled but didn't respond further. Sensing an opportunity, Charles Blackwood pressed on, "If Amelia has made up her mind, then my promise from that day still stands." Amelia Martinez was taken aback. She'd long since dismissed those words as playful banter. Why was he now bringing it up so seriously? She shook her head with a bitter smile, thinking how wonderful it would be if those words had come from Henry Blackwood. After Princess Oliver Kingsley returned that day, she caused another scene. Yet, strangely, Henry Blackwood bore it all in silence, showing no anger and treating her as if she didn't exist. This matter quickly reached the Empress Dowager's ears, and she summoned Princess Oliver Kingsley to the palace in anger. Despite her arrogance, Princess Oliver Kingsley still feared the Empress Dowager and went with her father to face her. "Oliver Kingsley, you must understand the responsibilities you bear. If you continue to act this way, you risk disrupting the greater plan." The Empress Dowager sat regally, her tone serious as she addressed her niece, who knelt before her. She could only blame herself for having spoiled this headstrong girl too much in her youth. The Prime Minister, deeply attached to his beloved daughter, chimed in, "Oliver Kingsley knows she was wrong. Please, allow her to stand." The Empress Dowager nodded, and Princess Oliver Kingsley was finally permitted to sit beside her father. In a gentler tone, the Empress Dowager said, "The prince has been harsh, but you must be more magnanimous. One day, you'll be Empress, responsible for the entire palace. Managing the thousands of women in the harem won't be easy." Hearing this, Princess Oliver Kingsley's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, showing she understood. The Prime Minister, noticing the Empress Dowager's softened demeanor, took this chance to voice his long-held doubts. "Your Majesty, there's something I don't understand." The Empress Dowager gestured for him to continue. "Henry Blackwood is merely a prince. Why do we arrange this marriage to support him for the throne?" The Prime Minister looked around to ensure they were alone before voicing his thoughts. He had been wondering about this for a long time and finally had the courage to ask. The Empress Dowager sighed and began to explain slowly, "The current Crown Prince, eldest son of the Empress, is a man of kindness and integrity, virtuous in character, and well connected with talented people throughout the land. The Emperor favors him as the future ruler." The Prime Minister looked at the Empress Dowager, puzzled. He already knew all this, so why was she repeating it? In his mind, it was obvious that his daughter should have married the Crown Prince. Why, then, choose a prince? Seeing his confusion, the Empress Dowager sipped her tea and continued, "The prince's character is fierce and meticulous, a rare talent. Furthermore, he is the son of the late concubine. Sadly, he has a violent nature, too full of hostility. He believes that his mother was killed by the Empress, and though he lacks evidence, he will never accept the Crown Prince's rule and would likely incite rebellion. Now that he's come personally to arrange this marriage, it's clear he values the military power held by your family," the Empress Dowager explained, "and he has promised to make Oliver Kingsley Empress. If we were to refuse, with his vengeful nature, he would surely drive the Prime Minister's household into a corner. The political landscape of North Exian Kingdom is clear enough. Many court officials support the prince, believing that the Crown Prince is too mild-mannered and kind-hearted to be a strong ruler." The Empress Dowager's words brought clarity to the Prime Minister, who now understood the well-considered strategy behind it all. The Prime Minister immediately turned to Oliver Kingsley, saying, "Oliver Kingsley, you've heard this, so you must behave from now on." Princess Oliver Kingsley quickly nodded, promising not to cause any more trouble. Now that she understood the gravity of the situation, she dared not act recklessly. When she entered the study, Princess Oliver Kingsley threw herself toward Henry Blackwood. He was reading, and as he saw his clingy wife, he could only sigh. Though he'd known this princess was spoiled and willful, he hadn't anticipated just how exasperating she could be. Henry Blackwood couldn't be too harsh, so he subtly put down his book and evaded her, asking coldly, "Why does my lady say such things? You haven't visited my chambers for days, my lord." I know I was wrong and promise never to behave that way again. Princess Oliver Kingsley felt deeply wronged by Henry Blackwood's recent indifference. She'd already tried to change for him, so why was he still treating her like this? Even though their marriage was built on politics, didn't every woman want happiness in her own life? Only now did Henry Blackwood realize that he had indeed spent most of his days in the study, avoiding her. He found her constant fussing exhausting and wished she could be quiet like Amelia. His mind drifted back to his last encounter with Amelia, puzzled by how bold and sharp she had become when she used to be quietly clever. Resigned, he nodded, willing to give in, but Princess Oliver Kingsley, unable to temper her natural temperament, seized the opportunity to ask more. Then promise me. She hesitated, then continued, promise me you won't go to see your former lover again, or else. Before she could finish, Henry Blackwood swirled his robe and stepped up to her, one hand closing around her throat. His eyes darkened as he asked in a low, menacing voice, or else what? Princess Oliver Kingsley was momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected Henry Blackwood to react so intensely or to dare treat her like this. Her resentment toward Amelia Martinez only grew. What did she lack compared to some courtesan? How could the Prime Minister's daughter be treated this way? Overcome by a mix of grief and anger, she whimpered, my lord, how can you treat me like this? Don't forget that my brother controls the army. A flicker of realization crossed Henry Blackwood's mind as he momentarily lost himself. Why did hearing Amelia Martinez's name make him so uncontrollably impulsive, almost endangering everything? Taking advantage of his distraction, Princess Oliver Kingsley quickly pulled free, coughing and red-faced, her eyes never leaving him. Relieved to have escaped his grasp, she moved aside, adopting a submissive demeanor as she pleaded, my lord, Oliver Kingsley was wrong. Please, punish me. Henry Blackwood's expression gradually returned to its usual cold indifference. Watching the woman before him, putting on a pitiful act, he chuckled inwardly. Outwardly, he showed no emotion, for, as she had reminded him, her brother held significant military power, and there was no telling if he might turn against him at a critical moment. With Princess Oliver Kingsley showing contrition, Henry Blackwood decided not to press further. He waved his hand, dismissing her without a word. Satisfied at having achieved her goal, Princess Oliver Kingsley curtsied politely, then left with a smile as graceful as a spring breeze. At that moment, Henry Blackwood finally sat down behind his desk, his face full of anger. He slammed his hand heavily on the table, producing a loud thud. No one had ever dared to threaten him, Henry Blackwood, and those who did would never meet a good end. He let out a cold laugh. Regardless of who it was, man or woman, no one could threaten him forever. After walking out, Princess Oliver Kingsley felt immensely pleased, her mood lightened considerably. No matter how impressive Amelia Martinez might be, if the prince didn't seek her out, what could she do? Surely, he would soon forget her. Thinking this, Princess Oliver Kingsley called for her personal maid and began adjusting her attire and jewelry. She was determined to make herself beautiful and avoid any more temper tantrums. With her charm, she didn't believe Henry Blackwood would be able to resist her and would forget about that courtesan, unless he wasn't a real man. This thought made Princess Oliver Kingsley chuckle. How could her husband not be a man? Although they hadn't spent much time together, she was already enamored with his strength and invincible spirit. Brother, are you sure that woman didn't suspect anything? Ronald Blackwood asked worriedly after hearing Charles Blackwood's account, feeling increasingly angry at Princess Oliver Kingsley. He couldn't fathom what that madwoman was up to, but if she jeopardized the plan, he'd be the first to strangle her. I'm not sure. Charles Blackwood shook his head, pacing with furrowed brows, lost in thought. He couldn't tell if Amelia Martinez had sensed his intentions or not. Charles Blackwood shook his head vigorously, pressing his fingers against his temple as he replied, I think even if she suspected something, she wouldn't have figured it out so soon. Are you sure there wasn't a single crack in her facade? Ronald Blackwood found it hard to believe Charles Blackwood's description. How could any woman remain so composed? If she didn't suspect anything, perhaps she simply didn't care. The idea chilled Ronald Blackwood. If she truly didn't care, then what was Henry Blackwood's purpose in placing her there? And it wasn't as if Henry Blackwood had been visiting her, which made Ronald Blackwood glance worriedly at Charles Blackwood. Charles Blackwood carefully thought back and then said, "No," she seemed calm, even smiling. "You know, I can read people, and if she were pretending, I would have seen through it." Ronald Blackwood nodded heavily. If that were true, he still couldn't be sure which kind of person she truly was. In that moment, he felt a pang of regret for letting his brother employ this plan. But now it was too late to turn back, and he couldn't think of a way to defuse this potential crisis. "Ronald, what's troubling you?" Charles Blackwood noticed Ronald Blackwood's reluctance to speak and sensed he had something weighing on his mind, so he asked directly. Ronald Blackwood hesitated, uncertain if he should speak. If his suspicions were wrong, it could disrupt Charles Blackwood's strategy. But if he was right and stayed silent, the consequences could be dire. After much deliberation, he finally said, "Brother, I suspect that woman might have been deliberately placed there by Henry Blackwood to lure you. She seems delicate but is actually strong-willed, and she might even know martial arts. I just fear that." Charles Blackwood fell into deep thought. He, too, had considered this possibility. For a woman to say such bold words was unusual. Then she reverted to her fragile, breathless demeanor, almost as if she were deliberately trying to hide her outburst. If that were the case, she was anything but simple, likely hiding many secrets. Could it really be that Amelia Martinez was a pawn Henry Blackwood had placed to mislead him? For a moment, Charles Blackwood was at an impasse, unable to determine the truth. The indifferent, aloof attitude of Amelia Martinez could very well indicate that she simply didn't care who he really was. Or perhaps she already knew his identity and was conspiring with Henry Blackwood to bring him down. "Send someone to keep watch on the Qingying Pavilion immediately," Charles Blackwood said, snapping his fan shut. Ronald Blackwood didn't ask further. He trusted his older brother's judgment. Besides, he thought it was wise to proceed cautiously. If those two really were in league, today's events would surely lead to a private discussion between them. "Keep a close eye on Ava Wilson and Emily Johnson," Charles Blackwood added, calling Ronald Blackwood back. To him, everyone at the Qingying Pavilion was suspect, especially as these two had gone missing for a time during Henry Blackwood's wedding. Since Henry Blackwood had once saved their lives, Charles Blackwood suspected they might be hiding something. Although Ronald Blackwood felt a pang of doubt, he didn't ask any questions, simply nodded and left. Charles Blackwood sat alone, mentally replaying the events of the day. Though he sensed something was off, he couldn't quite pinpoint the problem and had no choice but to rack his brain. He didn't want a plan that was 9/10 assured, he wanted absolute certainty. He needed to find out exactly who this woman was and what her true motives might be. On Amelia Martinez's side, after Princess Oliver Kingsley's disruption, Qingying Pavilion quickly became widely known, drawing many visitors. Ava Wilson told Amelia Martinez she didn't need to come out, they could manage the workload themselves. Initially, Amelia Martinez refused, but with so many people asking to meet her, she grew irritated and decided not to involve herself in the affairs of the front parlor. She entertained herself with Emily Johnson in the courtyard, passing time with riddles, martial arts practice, or occasionally reading. Soon, Amelia Martinez began to feel restless. She thought, as a modern person who had traveled back in time, she had to leave something behind to prove her existence. Perhaps she should brew a pot of wine, bury it underground, and let future archaeologists be shocked by the discovery. Who knows, maybe they'd trace it all back to China. Thinking this, Amelia Martinez couldn't help but laugh, puzzling Emily Johnson, who was cutting paper beside her and had no idea why Amelia Martinez was laughing to herself. As Amelia Martinez arranged the paper, she prepared to write some characters with a brush. But after writing a few cards, Emily Johnson looked at them, puzzled, asking her what those symbols were. Amelia Martinez felt a wave of discouragement. Not only did she not recognize the local characters here, but even her simplest symbols were seen as foreign. If it weren't for the linguistic knowledge she'd absorbed from this body, she'd be dealing with a severe language barrier. With no other choice, Amelia Martinez dictated while Emily Johnson wrote. The characters J, Q, K, A, and 2 were translated as 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. She was afraid if she used 1 and 2, she'd be bombarded with questions about why they were greater than 3. After thinking it over, this seemed like the simplest way. The hardest part was the 2 jokers. Not knowing how to explain, Amelia Martinez eventually gave up and drew 2 turtles, one big, one small. Emily Johnson looked on in confusion, and it took Amelia Martinez quite some time to explain before she finally understood, murmuring, "So, that just means, Big Brother." And thus, playing cards were born in ancient times. Though the coarse yellow paper was unrefined and inauspicious, it was the only durable paper they had, as the soft, translucent rice paper wouldn't work. Satisfied, Amelia Martinez organized her 54 cards. Despite the paper's rough smell, she asked Emily Johnson to call Ava Wilson and James Smith over. "What about the customers?" Emily Johnson asked worriedly. "If they were all busy here, who would mind the shop? Then just close up for the day." "It's not like we don't have enough money," Amelia Martinez replied after a moment's thought. Money wasn't the problem, she was simply bored out of her mind and needed something interesting to do, as well as people to play with. This. Emily Johnson seemed somewhat troubled, mumbling for a long while before voicing her concern. "Miss, you've only recently started dealing with business and may not fully understand. In business, trust is essential. If we open or close as we please, it reflects poorly on our reputation, and customers might stop coming to Chinying Pavilion." Amelia Martinez listened to Emily Johnson's lecture on business principles without interrupting, resting her chin on her hands with a smile, appearing to be intently listening. When Emily Johnson finally finished, Amelia Martinez nodded continuously, even encouraging her to keep going when she paused. But Emily Johnson could tell that Amelia Martinez hadn't really been listening and became irritated. Amelia Martinez quickly stood up, slinging her arm around Emily Johnson's shoulders like a man, causing Emily Johnson to blush shyly. Although her mistress was usually quirky, she still found that shoulder sling a bit uncomfortable. She awkwardly lowered her head, trying to distance herself from Amelia Martinez. Amelia Martinez knew Emily Johnson was uncomfortable and nervous, but instead of letting go, she tightened her grip, determined to get those around her to embrace the modern ways. As for casually slinging an arm around James Smith, she could only imagine it. Such a bold move would be deemed scandalous in this society. Not only would Ava Wilson and the others look down on her, but soon all of North Exile Kingdom would know her as a shameless woman. "Emily Johnson, you just don't get it. Where I come from, the more popular a place, the stricter its rules. That's how you keep people on their toes and make them even more eager to come back." Amelia Martinez confidently shared her marketing strategy, shamelessly claiming she'd invented it herself. This unconventional business logic left Emily Johnson bewildered. It sounded like it made some sense, but it was also bizarre. Just as Emily Johnson seemed about to say more, Amelia Martinez pressed a finger to her lips, signaling her to stop. She instructed her to follow the plan, then playfully shoved Emily Johnson out of the room. Ava Wilson and James Smith, hearing Emily Johnson's recount of Amelia Martinez's words, wore similar puzzled expressions. After hearing her explanation, again, they nodded in half understanding, but were unsure how to send all the guests away. As the two stood there in confusion, more guests began pressing them for service. For every new customer, Ava Wilson had to repeat the rule. Chinying Pavilion only offered 1 cup of wine per person per day, and customers had to answer a riddle correctly to earn it. The new guests, thinking highly of their own intellect, were confident they'd succeed. But those who had already tried the riddles knew how tricky they were and remained silent, watching with amusement as others failed. Those who guessed incorrectly left in disappointment but returned within days, hoping for another chance. As Ava Wilson became busier, Amelia Martinez grew impatient waiting in the courtyard. After a while, with no sign of Ava Wilson, James Smith, or Emily Johnson returning, she decided to head over to the front. Seeing the three still engrossed in handling the crowd, Amelia Martinez felt annoyed and stepped into the center of the room, raising her voice, "Dear guests, Chinyin Pavilion will be closing early today, and everyone's last drink is on the house." Already drawing attention, Amelia Martinez became the focal point as even more eyes turned toward her. Despite knowing the rules, some guests grumbled. They couldn't understand why the pavilion would turn them away and seemed insulted, thinking it bad business to risk offending them. Some customers left, bowing respectfully and leaving payment as they went. However, others refused to leave, most of whom were richly dressed, suggesting they were not entirely honorable. At that moment, Ava Wilson, James Smith, and Emily Johnson arrived and, seeing the dissatisfied customers, quickly tried to smooth things over. "Gentlemen, we apologize sincerely. Please come back tomorrow, and your tea will be on the house." Before she could finish, a wealthy-looking young lord tossed a piece of silver onto the counter with a look of disdain. He then directed his leering gaze at Amelia Martinez, his expression full of disrespect. Seeing the situation, Amelia Martinez furrowed her brow slightly, regretting her impulsive decision to step out. The richly dressed young lord grew even more brazen, mocking her as he said, "I've heard the owner here is a real beauty, and seeing her today, she could rival Amelia Martinez herself. If she'd personally serve us a cup of tea, I think we could work something out." A few others immediately chimed in with support. "Gentlemen, please show some respect. If you continue to act rudely, don't blame us for not showing courtesy." James Smith stepped forward without hesitation, standing protectively in front of Amelia Martinez as he spoke firmly. The young lord barely glanced at James Smith, letting out a derisive snort, his eyes filled with disdain. His attendants behind him also grew tense, as if ready for confrontation. Without a second thought, James Smith drew his sword, staring coldly at the leader. With such troublemakers, there was no room for leniency. Any sign of weakness would only encourage them. He turned to Amelia Martinez and said, "Sister Amelia, please step back." Amelia Martinez was a bit apprehensive, looking over at Ava Wilson, who nodded in reassurance, signaling that it was safe. Emily Johnson also tugged at her arm, urging her to leave. Amelia Martinez thought it over and realized that staying would only cause more trouble, so she retreated with Emily Johnson. It seemed the young lord wanted to block her way, but James Smith swiftly raised his sword to stop him. The young lord refused to back down, continuing his verbal taunts. As Amelia Martinez glanced back, she saw both sides drawing their swords before Emily Johnson quickly pulled her downstairs. Feeling anxious but unable to intervene, Amelia Martinez waited restlessly until she finally saw Ava Wilson and James Smith approaching. She hurriedly asked, "Did you manage to get rid of them?" James Smith nodded, reassuring her, "Just a band of ruffians. Don't worry." Relieved, Amelia Martinez nodded back, though she still felt guilty for causing trouble. She didn't know how to express her regret. Ava Wilson, ever perceptive, spoke up, "No need to blame yourself. Those people came with the intention of causing a scene, they've been hanging around for quite a while." "Really?" Amelia Martinez asked, half believing. She wasn't sure if Ava Wilson was just saying that to ease her guilt. James Smith nodded solemnly. He didn't know who those people were, but it was clear they would need to be more cautious from now on. Amelia Martinez still felt a lingering sense of dread. Had she not stepped out, all of this might have been avoided. She apologized for her recklessness, and Ava Wilson and James Smith reassured her until the matter was settled. "Sister, why did you call us here so urgently?" Ava Wilson asked. Grateful for the change in topic, Amelia Martinez readily followed along. Though she was curious about how the situation had been resolved, whether someone had come to their aid like before, she knew this wasn't the time to pry, so she seized the opportunity to move on. Here, this is what I wanted to show you. Back in my homeland, we call it a deck of cards. It's a fun game, Amelia Martinez explained, holding up the paper pieces she had cut out and explaining the game one step at a time. None of them had ever seen such a game before. The recent tensions were quickly forgotten in the face of this new amusement. In recent days, Amelia Martinez had introduced so many novel things that they were constantly amazed. Emily Johnson even remarked that if she ever had the chance, she would love to visit Amelia Martinez's homeland. At such moments, Amelia Martinez could only smile wryly. Even she couldn't return home now, let alone take others for a visit. But she couldn't tell them this, so she simply nodded and promised to take everyone if she ever had the chance. Her friends began imagining Amelia Martinez's world with excitement, while she alone carried a silent sadness, feeling deeply stifled inside. Look, line them up in order, you can play a straight, or pairs, Amelia Martinez patiently explained, like a teacher, though everyone's heads were spinning, they were also delighted, fully captivated by this game, it was as fascinating as solving riddles. Everyone tried to mimic Amelia Martinez's way of holding the cards, pinching them between their fingers like holding a little flag. But James Smith just couldn't get it right and kept clutching his cards in a messy bunch. Amelia Martinez patiently showed him over and over, but he couldn't correct his grip. Finally, she used her last tactic, saying, "Brother James Smith, if you hold your cards like that, everyone can see them, and you'll end up losing." At this, James Smith immediately clutched his cards to his chest, glancing left and right nervously. His reaction was so comical that everyone burst into laughter. After half a day of practice, they finally understood the rules of the game. One country with 2 kings, 4 types of people divided into 13 ranks. This group battles that group, and the other side retaliates. Together then apart, all chaos caused by humanity. Guess what it is? Amelia Martinez suddenly thought of a riddle and tossed it out to them. But everyone was so absorbed in the card game that they'd lost interest in riddles. Hearing Amelia Martinez's ill-timed question, they half-heartedly tried to guess for a bit before giving up, but not knowing the answer nagged at them. Finally, they begged Amelia Martinez to reveal the answer, unwilling to endure the suspense any longer. Amelia Martinez was just as eager to get the game started. Back in the modern world, she had to play a few rounds of cards every day to scratch her itch, and now that she had people to play with, she wasn't about to let the chance slip by. She gave a proud grin, held up the deck of cards, and said, "It's this." At first, Ava Wilson and James Smith didn't understand, looking at Amelia Martinez in confusion. She didn't explain, waiting until Emily Johnson caught on, who then exclaimed excitedly, "It's the deck of cards." So that's what the answer was. Amelia Martinez nodded, and only then did Ava Wilson and James Smith understand, nodding along. Still, Ava Wilson looked puzzled and, after some searching, held up the 2 prominent cards with the large and small turtles, asking, "But what's the connection between kings and turtles?" Amelia Martinez felt a bit embarrassed, realizing she couldn't exactly draw a king on the cards. Naturally, she wouldn't admit that she'd just drawn turtles because they were simpler than kings. Seeing Ava Wilson's confusion, both Emily Johnson and James Smith also looked at her, awaiting an explanation. Gathering herself, Amelia Martinez faked a few coughs, then said, "Actually, back in my homeland, the turtle is a symbol of the leader, the king." Everyone exchanged surprised glances. Though they'd thought the same thing, hearing Amelia Martinez say it still astonished them. They all mulled over her explanation, and finally, James Smith asked hesitantly, "But isn't turtle used as an insult? How could it mean the king?" Amelia Martinez didn't bat an eye, knowing no one here had been to the modern world, so she could say whatever she wanted without anyone challenging her. She replied smoothly, "It's like this, turtles live a long time, so they're seen as the leaders." Everyone nodded again, but Amelia Martinez still felt a bit anxious inside. Seeing that no one said anything more, she quickly steered the conversation back to the game to avoid further questions. "No more questions, right? If not, let's start playing." Though they still felt slightly skeptical, everyone's excitement about the game took over, and they set aside the confusing matter. The four of them straightened up, ready for their first round. Upstairs, Isabella Thorne leaned against the balcony railing, her gaze directed toward Qingyin Pavilion, her face filled with sorrow. No one knew what thoughts occupied her mind. Isabella. Charles Blackwood stood below, feeling a pang of heartache as he looked up at her. He walked softly up the stairs, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and whispered her name tenderly, his lips close to her ear. Startled at first, Isabella Thorne relaxed when she realized it was Charles Blackwood. She leaned into his chest, remaining silent. Both seemed to treasure this rare moment together, saying nothing as they gazed quietly into the distance. "Isabella, the position of Empress will always be reserved for you," Charles Blackwood murmured, his warm breath against her neck causing Isabella Thorne to shift slightly, feeling a bit unsettled. She knew that Charles Blackwood loved her and that she had no reason to worry. Hearing his words, she simply nodded softly. Isabella Thorne understood the importance of tact. Her father had taught her that a woman who knows when to advance and retreat would always have a man's affection. It was because of these teachings that she could remain calm even as Charles Blackwood pursued another woman. She understood that Amelia was merely a pawn, destined to be discarded in the end. "Did you see it that day?" Charles Blackwood suddenly asked. "Huh? See what?" Isabella Thorne, lost in thought, didn't immediately catch on and wasn't sure what he was referring to. "At the Fujian Flower Festival that day, you saw us, didn't you?" Charles Blackwood asked again, tightening his hold on her as though afraid she might slip away. Isabella Thorne felt the strength of his embrace and shifted slightly, feeling uneasy. But the more she moved, the tighter his hold became. She quickly took the hint, settling into his arms and savoring the embrace of the man she loved most. She nodded silently, then grew worried, fearing that Amelia Martinez might have seen them. She asked anxiously, "She didn't see us, did she?" Charles Blackwood rested his chin on top of her head, closing his eyes as he murmured, "No," and said nothing further. After a long silence, he added, "And even if she did, you are already mine." Isabella Thorne felt a surge of emotion, realizing that her place in Charles Blackwood's heart was indeed special. Though he said this to comfort her, she understood that Charles Blackwood simply didn't want her to be upset. She wasn't foolish enough to deliberately provoke Amelia Martinez or allow herself to be caught in such a situation. When Isabella Thorne didn't respond, Charles Blackwood thought she might be feeling jealous and gently asked, "Isabella, are you angry?" She quickly shook her head, turning to glance at Charles Blackwood briefly before lowering her eyes, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Isabella understands. Amelia is only a pawn, I won't feel jealous over her." For some reason, hearing Isabella Thorne refer to Amelia Martinez as just a pawn made Charles Blackwood feel a pang of guilt. He shook his head and sighed, which caught Isabella Thorne's attention, prompting her to ask why. After a pause, Charles Blackwood sighed again and said, "Amelia is a remarkable woman. It's a pity she was born in such troubled times." "So, are you feeling something for her?" Isabella Thorne asked, a trace of hurt and a tinge of fear in her voice. If Charles Blackwood had truly developed feelings, what would become of her? Charles Blackwood also sensed the change in Isabella Thorne's tone and realized he had spoken too much, a bit carelessly. Hurriedly, he comforted her, saying, "I only said it was a pity that she has to be sacrificed, but my heart will always belong to you, Isabella." As he said this, his eyes met Isabella Thorne's gentle gaze. Isabella Thorne quickly lowered her head, knowing that she shouldn't have asked so much. But upon hearing Charles Blackwood's reassuring words, she felt a small joy bloom inside. She knew when to stop pressing, choosing not to ask further. Isabella. Charles Blackwood held her close, resting his hand gently on her head, pulling her closer into his embrace. Isabella Thorne heard him call her name and looked up, only to accidentally brush her lips against his soft, warm mouth. Charles Blackwood deepened the kiss, tenderly yet passionately exploring her lips. Isabella Thorne was initially flustered, worried he might think of her as too bold, but when she realized he had initiated, she understood it was what he wanted all along. Her cheeks flushed red like ripe apples, bashful yet inviting. Charles Blackwood's desire grew stronger, his grip on her tightening, almost making her breathless. But he paid no heed, holding her as if wanting to merge her into himself so they would never be separated. Though her breaths were short, Isabella Thorne made no attempt to resist, silently embracing the powerful yet tender attention from the man she loved. She felt a strange sensation, as if a longing deep within her heart was finally being released. With the experience of their last encounter, Isabella Thorne was no longer as passive, shyly but willingly intertwining with Charles Blackwood. Her delicate hands wrapped around his strong waist, her entire body clinging to him. In this moment, she put aside all reservations, knowing she belonged to this man entirely, ready to yield to his every wish. Encouraged by her response, Charles Blackwood's kisses grew more intense, moving from her lips to her neck. Isabella Thorne felt her body tense as she struggled to endure his touch. Sensing her movement, Charles Blackwood held her even tighter, rendering her unable to move. Her slender, snake-like figure twisted in his arms, a sight that only further provoked his desire. Her breaths grew heavier, and Isabella Thorne began to feel a touch of fear. She whispered, "Brother Charles, please, stop." Her voice, soft and laden with affection, was like waves of heat washing over him. Charles Blackwood, as if transformed into a wild beast, could no longer restrain himself. With a loud bang, the door suddenly opened. You two carry on, I'll come back later," Ronald Blackwood stammered, realizing he had walked in at a rather inconvenient moment. Trying to ease the awkwardness, he mumbled something and quickly turned to leave. The two lovers, engrossed in each other's embrace, were taken completely by surprise. Isabella Thorne hid behind Charles Blackwood, her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't understand why both of her intimate moments with Brother Charles had been interrupted by Brother Ronald. Surely he must think her a loose woman. How could she ever face him again, or explain herself? Charles Blackwood understood Isabella Thorne's embarrassment. A young lady caught in such a situation would naturally feel deeply humiliated. He gently directed Isabella Thorne to retreat into the inner room, then turned back, his face dark as he glared at Ronald Blackwood, saying, "Since you're here, there's no point in leaving now." Ronald Blackwood let out a nervous laugh, trying to ease the tension as he rubbed his chin, which was devoid of stubble. He looked up at Charles Blackwood, knowing full well he had interrupted something important. "Well, out with it," Charles Blackwood said, flicking his sleeve and taking a seat on the nearby chair, waiting for Ronald Blackwood to speak. Ronald Blackwood adjusted his expression, his face gradually becoming serious. Then he spoke, "Did someone cause trouble at Serene Shadow Pavilion yesterday?" Charles Blackwood raised an eyebrow slightly, without looking up, his hand playing with a teacup as he asked with a smile, "Oh. Who would be so bold as to cause trouble at Serene Shadow Pavilion?" Ronald Blackwood frowned slightly, trying to decipher what Charles Blackwood was thinking. Initially, he thought this incident was orchestrated by Charles Blackwood, but now he wasn't so certain, so he said, "I've investigated. It was just a few playboys. They weren't skilled at all and were eventually chased off by two of Amelia Martinez's attendants." "Oh." Charles Blackwood finally looked up, stood up, and flashed a knowing smile, gently touching his lips as if savoring a taste from earlier. He suddenly turned to face Ronald Blackwood and asked, "And those two attendants, what do you think of them?" Ronald Blackwood didn't dare to conceal anything and promptly offered his assessment. It's hard to gauge their martial skills since those young men were so weak. They didn't reveal their true strength. Charles Blackwood nodded, the smile on his face gradually fading as he fell into contemplation. He then asked, did the observers notice anything unusual? Ronald Blackwood shook his head in disappointment, replying, the people at Serene Shadow Pavilion didn't show any unusual movements. Since yesterday afternoon, they've been closed, which led to the conflict. Closed? Why would they close? Charles Blackwood looked puzzled. To him, this should have been the peak time for Serene Shadow Pavilion's business, so why close without reason? Seeing Charles Blackwood's expression, Ronald Blackwood understood his meaning and continued, yes, I thought something might happen, so I had people keep a close watch on them, without letting them out of sight. But... At this point, Ronald Blackwood deliberately paused. Charles Blackwood squinted, listening attentively, and, noticing the sudden stop as if Ronald Blackwood wanted to keep something secret, he asked, though a bit displeased, so, what's the outcome? Amelia Martinez seems to be teaching them some kind of game. They played until late in the evening, with no other unusual activity. This morning, they gathered to play again and are still at it. Ronald Blackwood stifled a laugh, trying to maintain a serious tone as he reported the findings from their observers. Charles Blackwood seemed intrigued. He had previously witnessed that Amelia Martinez's group wasn't particularly bound by etiquette, and this time, it was also unclear what strange pastime she was introducing, causing her to forego business entirely. Seeing the faint smile appear on Charles Blackwood's face, Ronald Blackwood asked, elder brother, would you like to go see for yourself? Charles Blackwood waved his fan, his face returning to its usual playful and carefree expression, his hair naturally tousled, as he said, of course, I can't miss out on anything interesting. With that, Charles Blackwood vanished, leaving behind only a flash of white robe, gliding lightly like a celestial figure. Ronald Blackwood shook his head slightly, puzzled as he watched Charles Blackwood leave, increasingly unable to understand what was going on in his elder brother's mind. Before he left, he glanced back at the inner room, seeing that no one had come out yet. Surely, the earlier incident had left Isabella Thorne too embarrassed to appear. Ronald Blackwood couldn't help but shake his head, silently hoping that his elder brother could bring her happiness, otherwise, even if it was his elder brother, he would reclaim the woman he loved. After Ronald Blackwood left, Isabella Thorne finally stepped out, her face flushed. Watching the two of them leave without a word, a slight sense of disappointment crept into Isabella Thorne's heart. Earlier, when she saw Ronald Blackwood looking in this direction, she thought he had noticed her and didn't dare to move. Only after Ronald Blackwood left did she let out a sigh of relief. Watching the already distant figure of Charles Blackwood, a hint of sadness emerged in Isabella Thorne's heart. But this sadness was only temporary, and she soon regained her composure. Just now, she had actually overheard the conversation between the two brothers of the Coe family. Although her father had taught her that when men are discussing matters, a woman should know her manners and keep her distance. At first, she thought the same and planned to stay inside for a while. But as soon as she heard the conversation was about Amelia Martinez, her heart sank, and she couldn't help but listen in, unable to control herself. She thought that Charles Blackwood surely wouldn't mind her being there, otherwise, he wouldn't have discussed the matter in her room. Thinking of this, Isabella Thorne felt justified and no longer reproached herself. Isabella Thorne understood that Charles Blackwood must have gone to see Amelia Martinez by now. Unknowingly, a fierce glint appeared in her eyes, and she muttered, the position of Empress is mine, Isabella Thorne's, no one can take it from me. Amelia Martinez is just a pawn, so there's no need to waste emotions on her. Isabella Thorne looked in the direction of Serene Shadow Pavilion, no longer with her original sorrowful expression, but rather with something resolute and unwavering. Amelia Martinez and Emily Johnson were already engrossed in their game. After finishing their meal, they resumed playing. The cards from yesterday had become worn out, so Emily Johnson had already prepared a new set, asking everyone to wait patiently. Amelia Martinez felt her back and waist aching. It was no surprise, sitting here for so long. Thinking of the new moves Ava Wilson had just taught her yesterday, she took this moment to practice them. The techniques James Smith was teaching her were no longer the simple exercises for strengthening muscles and bones. Recently, her health had improved significantly, and she hadn't fainted again, so it seemed more practice was indeed beneficial. Now, James Smith was teaching her self-defense skills. James Smith said, "It's good for a girl to know some martial arts, otherwise, she'll always be bullied outside. Naturally, though, you don't need to be as fierce as Ava Wilson." When James Smith said this, Amelia Martinez and Emily Johnson burst out laughing, while Ava Wilson, hearing James Smith tease her, was not pleased and chased after him to hit him. James Smith ran ahead, continually pleading for mercy, while still managing to throw in a few more teasing remarks. "See? Look at her, she really is like that." Amelia Martinez could feel the changes in her body. A few days ago, when brewing wine, she had been able to lift the wine barrel on her own. The fact that she didn't faint afterward was already a good sign. Suddenly, there was a round of applause. Everyone looked in the direction of the sound and were surprised to see Charles Blackwood. Amelia Martinez quickly stopped her sword practice, approached him, and asked, "My lord, you're truly in high spirits. What brings you to Serene Shadow Pavilion today?" Charles Blackwood put away his fan and flicked his hair, which, to Amelia Martinez, looked no different from someone in the modern era trying to look cool, making her chuckle softly. Charles Blackwood wasn't bothered and turned to point at the front hall, saying, "Charles originally came to taste some wine, but I found everyone here abandoning work to play. Still, it's not disappointing. Seeing that Miss Amelia, so frail-looking, is also versed in martial arts." Amelia Martinez naturally didn't detect the probing undertone in Charles Blackwood's words. She simply thought that her recent changes might cause suspicion, so she quickly said, "Oh, it's nothing. Brother James Smith just saw that I was weak and often fainting, so he suggested I practice a little to strengthen my body. And you know, I've been feeling much healthier recently." Charles Blackwood smiled silently, neither doubting nor confirming Amelia Martinez's words. After all, things would soon become clear. But James Smith, standing beside him, saw Charles Blackwood's smirk and found it irritating. For some reason, James Smith deeply disliked this man in white, feeling that he was hypocritical and harbored ill intentions. He spoke with a pointed tone, "That's right. If a girl doesn't know a bit of self-defense, she'll end up being taken advantage of." After speaking, James Smith didn't forget to shoot a fierce glance at Charles Blackwood. Charles Blackwood was taken aback for a moment, then suddenly burst into laughter. He had naturally caught the hidden meaning in James Smith's words but chose not to expose it, instead following along. Indeed, for a talented and beautiful girl like Amelia, there's no shortage of admirers. It's wise to know some self-defense skills. Amelia Martinez noticed the tension between the two but couldn't understand why James Smith would confront Charles Blackwood like that. She quickly stepped in to defuse the situation, saying, all right, didn't you come to enjoy some wine today, my lord? Emily Johnson, bring some wine over." Emily Johnson had already sensed the tense atmosphere. Hearing her lady's command, she quickly acknowledged and went to fetch the wine. The three of them were left in an awkward silence. Charles Blackwood, however, seemed oblivious, calmly fanning himself as he sat across from Amelia Martinez. Noticing some cards on the stone table, he curiously asked, "What's this?" Amelia Martinez looked up and replied, "It's a game from my hometown, it's called poker." Poker? Charles Blackwood looked puzzled. He had never heard of such a thing before and asked, "If I may ask, where are you from, miss?" Amelia Martinez was taken aback, unsure how to respond. Last time, she had only mentioned to Ava Wilson that she wasn't from North Exian Kingdom, but no one had asked for specifics, and she hadn't thought much about it. Now, being asked directly, she truly didn't know how to answer. she couldn't exactly say she was from another world, could she? Seeing Amelia Martinez remain silent, Charles Blackwood didn't press further. To him, where she was from wasn't a big issue unless she had a reason to hide her origins. But these thoughts stayed in his mind, and he didn't say anything more, instead laughing heartily, "No problem, no problem. If it's inconvenient to say, that's fine, I was just asking out of curiosity." Amelia Martinez simply smiled, thinking to herself that Charles Blackwood must think she's rather reserved, unwilling even to reveal her hometown. She really only knew North Exian Kingdom and in Bangkok, and was unfamiliar with any other countries. She couldn't just make one up. Since Charles Blackwood had given her an excuse to avoid the question, Amelia Martinez gratefully accepted it. Emily Johnson had already brought out the wine. This grape wine was no longer as rare as it once had been. With some capital, Amelia Martinez had used a large wooden barrel to make a substantial amount, and the flavor had grown even richer. The wine glasses were now much more elegant, white and smooth like jade, and intricately carved. As Ava Wilson had once said, crafting such glasses was no easy feat, and even a skilled artisan might only produce 1 or 2 out of 100. At this point, Amelia Martinez had accumulated over 10 such glasses, a testament to how much silver she'd earned from the wine. This was also a major reason Amelia Martinez wasn't worried about closing her doors and having no customers. What an exquisite wine glass! Charles Blackwood couldn't help but exclaim in awe at the delicate, carved wine glass that looked like a rare beauty. The Jean Quan residence had no shortage of fine wine glasses, including many carved from jade and inlaid with gold. But compared to this slightly smaller, completely hollow carved glass, those others seemed insignificant. It wasn't overly luxurious, but it exuded a simple, elegant charm. The carved details made it seem as if the wine inside might spill out, and the thin, almost translucent glass was so expertly crafted that it was hard to imagine something so exquisite even existed. Amelia Martinez noticed Charles Blackwood holding the glass and staring at it without drinking, just like anyone seeing the glass for the first time, likely captivated by its craftsmanship. She couldn't help but smile, thinking, so even the Grand Prince's residence is not immune, the esteemed prince himself is entranced by a single glass. Emily Johnson was also quietly laughing beside her. Only then did Charles Blackwood snap out of his daze, noticing everyone watching him with amusement. Ordinarily, no one would dare laugh at him, the Crown Prince of North Exian Kingdom, but in front of Amelia Martinez's playful smile, he felt slightly embarrassed. Reflecting on his lapse, Charles Blackwood shook his head with a hint of self-mockery. As a crown prince, he had seen all sorts of treasures, yet here he was, enchanted by a glass. After sipping the wine, he realized the flavor was even richer and smoother than before. Charles Blackwood tapped his finger on the stone table, closing his eyes and savoring the taste, looking every bit like a wine lover. After a moment, he sighed, "This is truly fine wine." "Of course it is," Ava Wilson retorted, her face full of disdain. Charles Blackwood didn't mind and looked at Amelia Martinez with a faint smile, saying, "If you don't mind, Amelia, please allow me to take some of this wine back with me." Before Amelia Martinez could respond, both Ava Wilson and Emily Johnson exclaimed in unison, "No way." Charles Blackwood was momentarily awkward, his expression twitching slightly, not expecting that even as Crown Prince, he couldn't obtain a single glass of wine. Amelia Martinez looked apologetic as well. She glanced at Charles Blackwood, then gave Ava Wilson and Emily Johnson a slightly scolding look before saying, "Please, my lord, feel free. I have plenty of good wine here. If you wish, you're welcome to take some any time." Upon hearing this, Charles Blackwood's disappointment instantly vanished, replaced with excitement as he looked at Amelia Martinez in disbelief, asking, "Really?" He had only mentioned it casually, recalling how precious she had treated the wine before. Yet now she seemed to treat it as casually as tea, offering it so generously. Seeing Charles Blackwood's surprised expression, Amelia Martinez didn't want to reveal the significant change in her own behavior and calmly explained, "My lord, after all, Amelia is in the business of trade, so, Charles Blackwood immediately understood her intention. Indeed, if it was business, why wouldn't she sell it? He quickly responded, no problem at all. To enjoy such fine wine with such company, it would be worth any amount. Tomorrow, I'll have someone bring over gold and silver, and if it's not enough, just let me know. Amelia Martinez smiled and nodded, but in that smile, Charles Blackwood saw a hint of a shrewd merchant's satisfaction, making him wonder if Amelia Martinez's father had also been in business, passing down the art of profit-making to her. Emily Johnson and Ava Wilson finally understood Amelia Martinez's intention, their initial confusion turning to joy as they looked at her admiringly. Amelia Martinez didn't hold back and, with a deliberately mysterious tone, added, "My lord, this wine is sold exclusively to you, so I hope you can keep it a secret for Amelia." Charles Blackwood was already lost in his excitement about the wine and barely registered Amelia Martinez's words, nodding eagerly to everything she said. Amelia Martinez's smile grew even wider. Having obtained such fine wine, Charles Blackwood didn't linger any longer. He had achieved his purpose, plus received an extra flask of wine, so he quickly bid farewell to Amelia Martinez. Noticing the dissatisfied gazes around him, he decided it was best to make a swift exit. Once Charles Blackwood left, the group gathered around Amelia Martinez again. Emily Johnson's eyes sparkled with excitement as she said, "Miss, you truly know how to do business. Just one look at the prince and you could tell he's wealthy. We'll definitely make a good sum." Amelia Martinez nodded in agreement, exactly what she had in mind. Only Ava Wilson and James Smith seemed displeased. Noticing this, Amelia Martinez asked, "What's wrong, Sister Ava Wilson?" Ava Wilson and James Smith exchanged a concerned glance before voicing their worries. Ava Wilson spoke up with a look of concern, "Sister, it's best if we don't associate too much with this prince. Something about him just doesn't feel right." Amelia Martinez wasn't too focused on this issue, and upon hearing Ava Wilson's remark, she responded casually, "Oh. What makes you say that, Sister Ava Wilson?" Ava Wilson shook her head. "I'm merely suspicious, there's no concrete evidence." Amelia Martinez understood Ava Wilson's concerns well enough. In truth, she had long known Charles Blackwood's identity, and regardless of his intentions, she would be cautious in handling him. As for the wine, refusing a business opportunity or the chance to make money would be foolish. But she couldn't share her true thoughts with Ava Wilson and James Smith, lest it raise their suspicions. So, Amelia Martinez played it off as if she was oblivious. Ava Wilson noticed that Amelia Martinez hadn't heeded her advice, and sighed as if wanting to say more. But James Smith gently held her back, shaking his head, signaling her to say no more. Emily Johnson stood by, unsure whom to support. Amelia Martinez was fully aware of Ava Wilson's dissatisfaction, yet she couldn't openly acknowledge it, lest she reveal her own displeasure. Instead, she acted as though nothing was amiss and invited, "Sister Ava Wilson, come, let's continue with our card game." Ava Wilson was genuinely upset this time. She turned away and said, "No, I'm feeling a bit unwell today. Let's play tomorrow instead." Amelia Martinez was taken aback, realizing Ava Wilson was indeed angry. Over the past days, Ava Wilson had never been cross with her. Today's anger puzzled her, but she understood it stemmed from concern for her safety and suspicions toward Charles Blackwood. Regardless, it was for her own good, so Amelia Martinez knew better than to take offense. She stood up, ready to pull Ava Wilson aside to talk things over. But just as she rose, James Smith suddenly shouted, "Watch out." Amelia Martinez barely knew any martial arts and was oblivious to the approaching danger. Hearing James Smith's warning, she hesitated briefly, only to realize a moment later that a strand of her hair had been sliced. If she had hesitated any longer, she could have lost her life. Turning back, she saw James Smith had taken a blow meant for her. His clothes were torn, and blood was beginning to show on his arm. But James Smith didn't seem to care, not even flinching, and quickly joined the fight. Ava Wilson, too, was too preoccupied to stay angry. She saw that intruders in black had managed to infiltrate, and blamed her own carelessness for not detecting their approach earlier. They had almost taken Amelia's life. If anything happened to Amelia, she and her brother would be hard-pressed to answer to Prince Henry Blackwood. With that thought, Ava Wilson's previous dissatisfaction disappeared, replaced by a fierce hatred for the black-clad assailants who had nearly caused such an irreparable failure. Drawing her dagger, she intercepted one of the attackers. Although Amelia Martinez had been practicing martial arts for a while, she had never faced real combat. Seeing the viciousness of these intruders, she quickly realized they weren't ordinary fighters. For a moment, she was at a complete loss, even forgetting that she could try to run. Suddenly, two more men in black appeared from the forest. Ava Wilson and James Smith had barely been able to handle one attacker each, and now with two more emerging, it was clear that they were here specifically for Amelia Martinez. Realizing this, Ava Wilson couldn't help but glance toward the depths of the bamboo forest, certain that someone was observing from afar. Who knew how many more men in black lay in ambush, waiting to strike? James Smith quickly understood Ava Wilson's concern. Despite his left arm bleeding profusely, he ignored it and fought even more fiercely. The men in black were no ordinary bandits. Even as they faced Ava Wilson and James Smith, two highly skilled fighters, they showed no panic and even seemed to have the upper hand. This deeply worried Ava Wilson and James Smith, who could only blame themselves for not detecting the danger sooner to report back to Prince Henry Blackwood. "Amelia, run. You go first." Ava Wilson somersaulted in mid-air, brandishing her short blade with impressive skill. She noticed that one of the black-clad assailants was now targeting Amelia Martinez, who was desperately dodging his attacks, while Emily Johnson had already been struck by a sword and was lying on the ground. Amelia Martinez wanted to escape, but she was trapped, unable to break free. The man in black pressed her step by step, each move aimed to kill. What puzzled Amelia Martinez was that each time he was about to land a deadly blow, he would abruptly hold back, giving her a chance to counter. This cycle seemed endless, yet she couldn't escape. Panicking, Amelia Martinez thought hard about how to flee, wondering why she was targeted in the first place. Suddenly, she thought it might have something to do with closing the pavilion the previous day. Could it be that those spoiled young masters were so dissatisfied with her attitude that they hired assassins? Thinking of this, she felt utterly defeated. If given the chance, she swore she would treat them 1,000, even 10,000 times more respectfully than yesterday. But those young masters were ruthless indeed. Even if she was a beauty, how could they bear to treat her so harshly? Just as she was losing hope, her strength almost depleted, a flash of white appeared out of nowhere. At first, Amelia Martinez thought it was another assassin, but looking closer, she realized it was Charles Blackwood, who had already left earlier. His white robe stood out vividly among the black-clad attackers. Charles Blackwood wielded no traditional weapon. Instead, he used his usual folding fan, which suddenly displayed astonishing power. He drove one of the assassins back to a tree, where the man couldn't retreat further, and then asked sternly, "Who sent you?" The man in black refused to answer, attempting to resist further. At that moment, two more assassins lunged forward, this time targeting Charles Blackwood directly. With no time to question further, Charles Blackwood exerted more force, causing the man in black to cough up blood and collapse. Amelia Martinez watched in terror, relieved that Charles Blackwood had come to her rescue. No one was attacking Amelia Martinez at the moment, so she quickly ran to Emily Johnson's side. If it hadn't been for Emily Johnson taking that sword blow on her behalf, she might be the one lying there now. This thought filled Amelia Martinez with both sorrow and a profound sense of warmth. Emily Johnson was only her maid, though Amelia Martinez had called her sister many times, but Emily Johnson had always cared for her just as before. Last time, Emily Johnson had been nearly beaten to death over a petty theft accusation, and now, she was injured again for protecting her. The fact that someone would treat her so kindly brought Amelia Martinez to tears. Lying in Amelia Martinez's arms, Emily Johnson heard someone crying. She opened her eyes slightly, realizing it was Amelia Martinez. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but seeing it was real, she guessed that Amelia Martinez was heartbroken over her injury. Despite the pain and the hurried bandaging by Amelia Martinez, Emily Johnson forced a reassuring smile and said, "Miss, Emily Johnson is all right. Please don't cry." Amelia Martinez felt a slight relief as she saw Emily Johnson regaining consciousness and reassured her that they'd soon be able to see a doctor. But as she finished speaking, Amelia Martinez looked up and saw a sharp, gleaming sword thrusting directly toward Charles Blackwood. Before she could scream, the long sword had already pierced Charles Blackwood's left shoulder. Ava Wilson and James Smith were equally stunned. They had seen how skilled Charles Blackwood was. Even with both of them struggling to hold off a single attacker, Charles Blackwood had easily killed one of the black-clad assailants. Just when they thought victory was within reach, Charles Blackwood suffered a severe injury. Ava Wilson and James Smith hesitated, now questioning who could have sent these highly trained fighters. At first, they had thought, like Amelia Martinez, that the attackers were sent by the rowdy troublemakers from the day before. But as the fight continued, they realized something was amiss. If it were those young nobles from yesterday, they would have likely hired some ordinary thugs. But these assailants were far from simple, they seemed like professional killers from a well-trained organization. For such a trivial matter, it was unlikely that those spoiled young men would spend a fortune to hire assassins of this caliber. Charles Blackwood gritted his teeth, enduring the pain as he pulled the sword out and threw it with all his strength. Although his opponent tried to dodge, the blade still tore his clothing. Charles Blackwood then launched a counterattack, wielding his fan with such grace that his movements resembled a beautiful dance. Amelia Martinez found herself mesmerized, forgetting the peril around her as she watched in awe. Charles Blackwood's clothes were now soaked in blood, a vibrant red that dazzled her eyes, reminding her of the crimson wedding dress she had once worn, radiant and eye-catching. She remembered their first meeting when Charles Blackwood had been so elegant and refined. She never imagined their fates would be entangled to this extent. Amelia Martinez couldn't deny feeling touched. Here was someone not even close to her, risking his life to save her. The doubt she had harbored about his intentions melted away. If it were merely for show, he could have left without looking back. But instead, he returned, braving danger. Even Ava Wilson and James Smith were shocked by his actions. Charles Blackwood continued maneuvering between the two assassins, but Amelia Martinez could see that he was weakening. His fan movements had become purely defensive, merely shielding himself without the strength or intent to attack. At that moment, Amelia Martinez decisively set Emily Johnson down and joined the fight. Initially, she felt afraid, but seeing Charles Blackwood's body gradually wearing out, she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just stand by while others risked their lives to protect her, that would be intolerable. Though Amelia Martinez wasn't skilled in martial arts and barely knew any proper moves, her agility allowed her to dodge a few attacks. Charles Blackwood looked surprised as he saw Amelia Martinez jumping into the fray, creating a brief moment of respite for him. His heart filled with appreciation, but he still said, "Amelia, go now. I can handle these men." Amelia Martinez didn't notice the subtle change in his tone, as if he had called her Amelia 1,000 times before. But Amelia Martinez wasn't about to listen to Charles Blackwood's advice, nor did she fully register his words. At this point, even if she wanted to escape, she couldn't leave. She replied, "In a time of great danger, how could I just watch you all suffer on my behalf?" Before she could finish, Amelia Martinez felt a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen. Though the assassin held back slightly, he still managed to slash her stomach. Had it not been for Charles Blackwood's intervention, who knew how deep the wound would have been? Meanwhile, Charles Blackwood sustained another wound on his arm, fresh red blood dripping down. Ava Wilson and James Smith witnessed everything. When the assassin attacked, they had rushed to help Amelia Martinez dodge, but Charles Blackwood had swiftly intercepted the sword with his arm. Both Ava Wilson and James Smith breathed a sigh of relief, and any lingering grievances they held toward Charles Blackwood vanished. They exchanged a grateful glance in his direction. Ava Wilson and James Smith used the last of their strength. With Charles Blackwood's help, the men in black were clearly at a disadvantage. After James Smith struck down one of them, the remaining two fled in panic. James Smith threw a dart, instantly killing one of the retreating attackers. Ava Wilson and James Smith were about to give chase, but Charles Blackwood stopped them, saying, "Everyone's already wounded. Better not pursue them." At this moment, Charles Blackwood's white robe was stained with blood, and his usual carefree and graceful demeanor now appeared rather disheveled, making Amelia Martinez feel a twinge of sympathy. This time, Ava Wilson and James Smith obeyed without question, perhaps out of gratitude for Charles Blackwood saving them. They approached him to offer their thanks, saying, "We owe you, my lord. Without your help, we really wouldn't know what to do." Charles Blackwood waved them off, but the movement aggravated his wound, and he winced as blood began to pour from his shoulder, his face paling. Amelia Martinez quickly took out her handkerchief to bind his wound. However, her usual cloth had already been used to bind Emily Johnson's injury, so she was left with her embroidered silk handkerchief, adorned with a black crane. Although reluctant, she resolved to use it and firmly tied the cloth around Charles Blackwood's shoulder. Charles Blackwood noticed her moment of hesitation, reading the conflicted look in Amelia Martinez's eyes before she ultimately decided to bandage him. He recalled the time by the lake when he had asked her about the significance of this handkerchief, and she had been visibly flustered, which led him to think it must have some special meaning, perhaps even an embroidery done by Henry Blackwood himself. At this thought, Charles Blackwood couldn't help but let a faint, almost imperceptible smile play on his lips. Amelia Martinez watched the black crane on the handkerchief gradually turn red with blood, but even the red could not completely obscure the dark hue of the crane. Among the group, only Ava Wilson was uninjured, so she quickly suggested Amelia Martinez head inside to rest while she applied some herbal medicine to stop the bleeding until a doctor could be called. At this point, Amelia Martinez began to feel the dull pain in her abdomen. She prepared to stand up, only to feel herself suddenly lifted into the air, realizing that Charles Blackwood had picked her up. Blushing with embarrassment, Amelia Martinez noticed blood flowing heavily from his shoulder and quickly protested, "My lord, please, there's no need. I can still walk." Charles Blackwood paused, looked at his wound, and realized she was concerned about him losing too much blood. Smiling boldly, he replied, "It's just a bit of blood, it's nothing for a man. But if you move, you'll just keep bleeding. You're already weak, that won't do. Don't move, let me handle this." Ava Wilson and James Smith didn't stop him, almost as if they tacitly approved. They stood behind him, watching Charles Blackwood carrying Amelia Martinez, exchanging a glance, each uncertain of what the other was thinking. Only when Emily Johnson groaned in pain did they snap back to reality, quickly carrying Emily Johnson into the room as well. Amelia Martinez's face was already flushed. Charles Blackwood was the second man after Henry Blackwood to come into close contact with her, and it made her heart race. Turning her face away, she pretended to be in pain, but Charles Blackwood, unaware of the reason, anxiously checked her pulse and forehead. It was only when Ava Wilson entered the room and asked everyone to leave that Amelia Martinez was finally able to have her wound properly bandaged. Amelia Martinez felt a sharp pain, like salt being rubbed into her wound, bringing beads of sweat to her forehead that rolled down her face. Seeing this, Ava Wilson couldn't help but feel sympathy. She comforted her while working, "Sister, just hold on for a bit. It's hard to bear at first, but this medicine works fast. It'll feel better soon." Amelia Martinez gritted her teeth and nodded, her face pale and drained of color. Soon, she drifted into a daze, falling into a deep sleep. When she woke up, another wave of pain hit her, and even the slightest movement was unbearable. Looking around, she was surprised to see Charles Blackwood sitting beside her. Charles Blackwood had changed into clean clothes, which looked like they belonged to James Smith. Even in this coarse fabric, he appeared strikingly handsome, his features sharp and well-defined. The gentleness usually evident in his appearance was replaced by a rugged charm. Hearing her stir, Charles Blackwood looked up, and their eyes met. His gaze was warm and intense, making Amelia Martinez feel embarrassed, causing her to quickly lower her head. She had never felt this way before, his eyes seemed to hold a strange power, drawing her in. "Are you feeling all right?" Charles Blackwood asked gently, reaching out as if to check her forehead, but Amelia Martinez instinctively flinched away, making him feel slightly awkward. Moving caused her stomach to throb painfully, and her brow furrowed in discomfort. Inwardly, Charles Blackwood couldn't help but admire her beauty, even as she frowned. Trying to cover his admiration, he playfully chided, "I told you not to move, but you didn't listen." Amelia Martinez felt her face turn bright red, the heat spreading to her neck. Meanwhile, Charles Blackwood acted as if nothing had happened, seemingly oblivious to her blush. She didn't try to explain and instead hid under the blanket, pretending to sleep. The two stayed in silence until Ava Wilson came in with medicine, breaking the awkward tension. Unaware of what had transpired, she kindly asked, "Are you all right, sister?" Amelia Martinez peeked out from the blanket and shook her head. Charles Blackwood offered to help her drink the medicine, but she politely declined, taking the bitter black liquid and downing it in one gulp. Immediately, she felt her stomach churning, her eyes rolling as the horrible taste settled. Thankfully, she had forced it down in one go, otherwise, she might not have had the courage to take a second sip. She was glad she hadn't accepted Charles Blackwood's offer to help her drink it. Had she needed to drink more, she would have avoided it even through the pain. Ava Wilson understood Amelia Martinez's discomfort. When James Smith drank the medicine, he had grimaced and struggled to finish it in one gulp. Surprised by her fortitude, Ava Wilson quickly brought her some candied fruit to ease her stomach. Inwardly, Charles Blackwood was impressed. He recalled how much coaxing it took to get Isabella Thorne to drink even a little medicine when she was ill. Yet Amelia Martinez had drunk the bitter concoction on her own in one go. Despite her delicate appearance, she had a resilience he couldn't help but admire. "Ava Wilson, has James Smith and Emily Johnson had their medicine yet?" And Amelia Martinez glanced at Charles Blackwood, unsure how to address him. Normally, she called him "sir," but after he had saved her life, that felt overly formal. She knew his name was Charles Blackwood, but addressing him by just Charles seemed too familiar. Torn, she couldn't decide on the right words, trailing off mid-sentence. Fortunately, Ava Wilson quickly understood what she meant and replied, "I'll prepare another bowl right away." "I didn't expect you to still be here, my lord." With that, Ava Wilson left, and Amelia Martinez nodded. "I think this place is still unsafe," Charles Blackwood said. "It's isolated, and if anything were to happen here, no one would know. If we encounter something like this again, we may not be so lucky. We still don't know who those people are. Since they didn't succeed this time, they might come back at another opportunity. We may be caught off guard," James Smith said, voicing his own concerns. After hearing Charles Blackwood express the same thoughts, he agreed and spoke with a serious tone. Ava Wilson frowned. Clearly, she had also considered this possibility, but at the moment, she didn't know where else they could go. Seeing everyone's silence, Charles Blackwood turned his gaze to Amelia Martinez and spoke up, "If you don't mind, you're welcome to stay at my residence for a few days. I'm sure those assassins, however bold, wouldn't dare cause trouble at the prince's estate." Before Amelia Martinez could respond, Ava Wilson interjected, "No, we don't know the young lord well enough. Today's events are already too much to impose upon you. I'm sure my sister would also feel uncomfortable if we were to drag you further into this." Amelia Martinez had been planning to decline Charles Blackwood's offer herself, unsure how to politely turn him down. Upon hearing Ava Wilson's response, she quickly agreed, "Yes, you've been a great help, my lord. We can't trouble you any further." Amelia Martinez understood that if they went to Charles Blackwood's estate, no one would dare make a move there, especially at the Crown Prince's residence. Yet, she had no desire to leave her current place or to be drawn closer to Charles Blackwood's true identity. "They'll come back eventually if you stay here," Charles Blackwood persisted, clearly disappointed but undeterred. He emphasized the danger, hoping to convince them to leave with him. "No need. This place may be unsafe, but we have somewhere else we can go," Ava Wilson replied, refusing his offer. Her tone was colder, a stark contrast to the gratitude she had shown earlier. Amelia Martinez had never seen Ava Wilson like this before, and a small flicker of unease stirred in her heart. This feeling was somehow connected to Henry Blackwood, adding to her uneasiness. She began to feel that the relationship between Ava Wilson and Henry Blackwood was not as casual as Ava Wilson had led her to believe. In this moment, Ava Wilson's demeanor appeared assertive and unyielding, as if she had been sent by Henry Blackwood specifically to watch over her. Amelia Martinez had a sense of where Ava Wilson intended to go, but she doubted that Henry Blackwood would actually take her to his palace. Most likely, he would find a hidden place to keep her. She had long decided to free herself from Henry Blackwood's grip, and this moment presented a rare opportunity. Without further thought, Amelia Martinez looked at the others, who were awaiting her final decision. Charles Blackwood noticed the uncertainty in her eyes, wondering why she seemed so conflicted. Was it truly so difficult to leave this place? But then he detected a glimmer of resolve in her gaze, and he knew he had a chance. Sure enough, Amelia Martinez finally spoke, "Then, I'll take you up on your offer for a few days, my lord." Charles Blackwood immediately laughed heartily, ignoring his pain as he said with a smile, "Nonsense, nonsense. It will be an honor to have you, Amelia." Amelia Martinez was fully alert now and, hearing Charles Blackwood address her so warmly, felt her cheeks flush. It was as if they had known each other for years, an unexpected and inexplicable familiarity. Meanwhile, Ava Wilson observed this change, surprised that Amelia Martinez had actually agreed to stay at Charles Blackwood's residence without hesitation. Ava Wilson had tried several times to tell Amelia Martinez that Charles Blackwood was actually the Crown Prince, the sworn enemy of Prince Henry Blackwood. She was worried that if they went to his residence, Charles Blackwood might use Amelia Martinez to threaten the prince. At the moment, she felt anxious and powerless, unsure if Henry Blackwood had received any news, as they had no way to contact him. Ava Wilson was about to continue persuading her, but Amelia Martinez interrupted, "Sister Ava Wilson, we should go along with the young lord's plan. It truly isn't safe here." Ava Wilson seemed to want to say something more, but she finally sighed, unable to find the right words, and reluctantly agreed. After gathering a few essentials, Ava Wilson and James Smith prepared to set off in haste. Charles Blackwood lifted Amelia Martinez into his arms again. After the earlier contact, they both felt a bit less awkward. Emily Johnson remained unconscious and was being carried by James Smith. He reassured Amelia Martinez that her condition wasn't serious, she had only fainted from pain, which helped Amelia Martinez feel more at ease. Just as they climbed into the carriage, Amelia Martinez seemed to remember something and quickly said, "Brother James Smith, could you help me bring something?" James Smith had just covered Emily Johnson with a blanket. Hearing Amelia Martinez call for him, he turned and asked, "What is it, Amelia?" Seeing how patient and calm James Smith was, even though he seemed a bit reluctant, Amelia Martinez felt comforted. When she mentioned she wanted a jar of wine, James Smith couldn't resist teasing her, so, Amelia turns out to be quite a spirited one, not forgetting to take a jar of wine even now. Amelia Martinez just smiled, not offering any further explanation. Charles Blackwood seemed pleased and, looking at the barrel of wine, joked, "Now I'll have free wine to drink, along with such fine company, truly one of life's great pleasures. Outside, James Smith and Ava Wilson rode alongside the carriage, but Ava Wilson's expression seemed rather solemn. Amelia Martinez wasn't used to seeing Ava Wilson like this, as she was typically cheerful. Now, her serious demeanor felt somewhat unsettling, leaving Amelia Martinez wondering if she was seeing her true nature or if Ava Wilson was truly upset. Amelia Martinez whispered to James Smith, "Brother James Smith. Sister Ava Wilson still seems angry with me. Could you please try to calm her down?" James Smith frowned slightly, unsure why his sister's mood had been increasingly unpredictable lately, and unable to understand her lack of control over her emotions. He reassured Amelia Martinez with a gentle tone, "That's just how Ava Wilson is. Don't take it to heart, Amelia." Amelia Martinez quickly nodded, grateful for James Smith's comfort. She added, "Thank you, Brother James Smith. Could you also tell her something for me? A person was being chased by a tiger and came upon a wide river. Though he couldn't swim, he still managed to cross it. How did he do it?" James Smith laughed, nodded, and went outside. Inside the carriage, Charles Blackwood and Amelia Martinez were left alone, creating an awkward silence as they struggled to find something to say. Charles Blackwood coughed lightly, smiling as he said, "You still have the spirit for riddles at a time like this?" Amelia Martinez only smiled, not directly answering. She felt that there was some hidden secret between these people, a significant one she didn't know about, which might even involve her. And perhaps, this secret was connected to the throne in ways she hadn't yet discovered. A fleeting thought passed through Amelia Martinez's mind, one so startling that it left her heart pounding. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm herself, silently repeating, "It's not real, I'm just overthinking it." Charles Blackwood noticed her sudden change in expression, one hand clutching her chest, looking both shocked and fearful. Though he caught a glimpse of her emotions, he couldn't understand what could have possibly caused such a composed person, one who remained calm even in the worst of situations, to display fear. Realizing Charles Blackwood was observing her, Amelia Martinez forced a smile to mask her anxiety and said, "Why don't you take a guess, my lord?" Charles Blackwood thought about it. It was difficult to grasp a question with no context, but he had often read people's personalities through their words. Take Isabella Thorne, for instance, with her bright and cheerful manner, even her casual remarks reflected her joy, and her mood would affect him too. If Isabella Thorne was upset, even a slight frown would convey her sorrow to him. But Amelia Martinez was different, her words often seemed disjointed. One moment, she was downcast, and the next, her mood would shift dramatically, as if she were two different people. Her changes were so natural and unpredictable that he barely had time to react before she transformed again, leaving him puzzled. How could he ever reach her heart? "You should just call me Charles," Charles Blackwood said after a moment, trying to make things feel less formal. Amelia Martinez also found "my lord" too distant but felt hesitant to take the liberty of calling him by name. Now that Charles Blackwood had made the suggestion himself, refusing would seem ungracious, so she replied, "Charles." Yet, as soon as she said it, she felt uncomfortable. Calling him Charles stirred memories of that night, of Henry Blackwood. Charles Blackwood could see all of this in her face, sensing her pain mixed with a radiant smile. It left him with a strange illusion. This woman seemed to be two people in one, someone with deep, inner sorrow, yet at the same time, a bright and cheerful soul. How could such contrasting traits blend together so seamlessly? It was impossible to tell which was the real her, or if either of them truly were. "You are truly a fascinating woman." "I feel like you're not, you," Charles Blackwood said, opening his fan and looking at Amelia Martinez as she seemed lost in thought. To him, the comment was light, almost a jest, but to Amelia Martinez, it was anything but simple. His words struck her, sending a shiver through her. He had unknowingly touched on her deepest truth: she was not who she appeared to be. But who was she, really? Amelia Martinez glanced at Charles Blackwood's smiling face, aware that he meant nothing by it. No matter how clever he was, he could never imagine that another soul existed within her. Who would believe such a thing? They'd think her mad, or a witch. Best case, she'd be locked away for life, worst case, burned at the stake. Of course, Amelia Martinez had no intention of sharing this secret with anyone, not even Emily Johnson. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, the urge to unburden herself would arise, but she always held it back, knowing that once spoken, a secret could no longer protect her. She feared it might one day bring disaster upon her. So, she chose not to dwell on Charles Blackwood's comment. Instead, she smiled back, appearing calm and unbothered, though her heart was churning, nearly ready to overflow. The two fell silent, but just then, Emily Johnson woke up. Though Amelia Martinez's abdomen was throbbing with pain, she forced herself to move closer, her face full of concern, and asked, "How are you feeling? Any better?" Emily Johnson's face began to regain some color, no longer shifting between pale and green. Her hair, however, was damp with sweat and stuck to her face. Amelia Martinez, knowing how much Emily Johnson must be hurting, gently smoothed her hair and said, "Don't speak, just rest." Emily Johnson nodded obediently, glancing around the carriage as if she wanted to say something. Amelia Martinez guessed her thoughts and spoke before she could, "We're on our way to Charles's, the young lord's residence." Emily Johnson seemed to understand, blinking once before falling silent. Meanwhile, Amelia Martinez felt herself blush, unsure if Emily Johnson had heard her slip and call him Charles. If she'd been her usual lively self, she would have surely teased her about it. Suddenly, the carriage jolted, and Amelia Martinez lost her balance, pitching forward. Charles Blackwood quickly reached out to steady her, and she ended up falling right into his arms. Embarrassed, she glanced at Emily Johnson, who, noticing the situation, tactfully closed her eyes and pretended to sleep. This spared Amelia Martinez some of the embarrassment. However, the wound in her abdomen ached sharply, and blood began to seep through her hands as she clutched it. Seeing this, Charles Blackwood didn't wait for her protest, he simply pulled her close and lifted her into his arms, holding her securely. At first, Amelia Martinez resisted a bit, but as she watched the blood flowing from her wound and felt the strength of his hold, she stopped struggling. Noticing that Emily Johnson was pretending to sleep, she closed her eyes as well, feigning sleep. But the pain in her abdomen and the rapid beating of her heart reminded her that this was all too real. She was lying in the arms of a man who was a stranger to her. If Henry Blackwood saw this, would he strangle her himself? Amelia Martinez suddenly thought of Henry Blackwood and imagined his burning rage. Images from TV dramas popped into her mind, showing his eyes ablaze with fire, with flames even blazing behind him. Amusing herself with this thought, Amelia Martinez found herself smiling slightly and, without realizing it, drifted off to sleep. Charles Blackwood watched Amelia Martinez sleep peacefully, wondering what pleasant dreams she was having that could make her smile so freely, with such pure joy. At first, he thought she was only pretending to avoid awkwardness, but when he lightly brushed his hand across her flawless cheek, he realized she was truly asleep. His fingers trembled slightly as they touched her face, and he quickly withdrew his hand, shifting his gaze to the window with a sense of surprise. Night had fallen, and the stars scattered across the sky like jewels against black silk. The bright stars surrounded the crescent moon, twinkling as if telling their own stories. Charles Blackwood fell into quiet contemplation. "Big brother, what happened today?" Ronald Blackwood asked as he approached, spotting Charles Blackwood carrying an injured woman in front of him. Behind them, someone else was holding another wounded girl. While tending to his own wound, Charles Blackwood replied nonchalantly,